All right, that's my cue. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde to the first Fourth Space event of 2021. We're back. Fourth Space is interested in connecting with the process, exploration, and development of projects related to research initiatives and pedagogy that are brewing at Concordia University. So it's really a great pleasure for us to support Yara Magazine and the Concordia Undergraduate Journal of Art History, or CUJAH, in the speaker series. I will let the organizers contextualize this series and introduce today's speaker, but before doing so, just wanted to make a few remarks. This event is being recorded and is live streaming at CU Fourth Space on Facebook, so I'll put the link to that in the chat in just a second. We invite you to activate the chat while you're here with us today with any comments or any kind of reflections that you have throughout this talk and conversation. But if you do have a question that you'd like Michelle to address directly, please use the Q&A feature of the webinar, making Sarah, who's our moderator today, making her job a little bit easier as the place that she will keep an eye on during the question period. Otherwise, if you don't want to spell out your question or comment, we invite you to raise your virtual hand and we can unmute you so that you can speak directly to Michelle. So on that note, thank you for being here once again, and over to you, Amel.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Fourth Space for hosting us today. Hi, everyone. I'm Amel. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Yiara Magazine, and welcome to the first part of our month-long speaker series, Coffee Dates with CUJAH and Yiara. Just to explain the series a bit, as the two art history publications on campus, we thought it would be a good opportunity to host a series that would allow us to showcase different voices and speakers from our creative community and just generally just foster a casual space for conversation and community and exchange and learning. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. McGeough with us today as our very first guest in the series. And just before we introduce Dr. McGeough, we just wanted to say a few words about our respective organizations.
Do you want to say something about Yara first, Amel?
Oh, of course, yeah. So just to introduce Yara Magazine. Yara Magazine is a student-run undergraduate feminist art publication based in Montreal. And we publish an annual print issue of curated student writing and artwork, organizing a variety of workshops, discussions, and lectures along the way. And we also host an end-of-year vernissage and magazine launch as well.
And I'm Kari. I'm the editor-in-chief of CUJAH, as Anna mentioned, which is a student-run association that aims to showcase the talents of Concordia's art history and fine arts students through the publication of an annual journal and conference. We're really happy to be partnering with Yara and Fourth Space on this coffee date series this month, which, as the title implies, are a couple over coffee type conversations that we might have had or might have experienced in person altogether. But unfortunately, obviously, we can't do this, so we hope you all have a nice warm beverage on hand nonetheless. Before I pass it over to our guest speaker, Dr. McGeough, I would first like to acknowledge the unceded Indigenous lands we are virtually gathered on today, which are those of the Ganakauga Nation, who are recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. CUJAH Montreal has long served as a gathering place for many First Nations and now is home to many diverse people. We give thanks to these First Nations who have cared and continue to care for this land and respect our continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in CUJAH. If you're not currently in CUJAH Montreal, please take a moment to think about the lands that you are residing on and occupying. I'm zooming in from Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. McGeough, a very recent addition to Concordia's Art History Department. Dr. McGeough is an art historian, having completed her PhD at the University of New Mexico, but before this, she has worked as a curator and has degrees in education and media studies. Her research focuses on Indigenous two-spirit identity and gender fluidity and how these impact artistic production. She is also interested in Indigenous research methodologies and how these can shape the curriculum and curation praxis of Indigenous art. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michelle, and giving us a glimpse into your research.
Thank you. I'll just start with sharing my screen. Here we go. So Tansei, Michelle McGeough, Nasiga-san, Amiskawas Kaskiagan. Greetings. My name is Michelle McGeough. I come from a place known as Beaver Hill, situated on the plains of Treaty 6 territories and homeland of the Métis, in what is now known as Alberta, Canada. I am of Indigenous and settler descent. My father was an immigrant from Northern Ireland, and my mother was Cree Métis with a little bit of Welsh added to the mix. I introduced myself in this manner as a way of situating myself within the context of my talk. I also wish to acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest in these territories, and I would like to express my gratitude to the original caretakers and to recognize the Kanagahaga Nation's sovereignty over these territories presently occupied by the settler nation state. The title of my talk today is Activating Indigenous Knowledge, Contemporary Indigenous Artists, Push Beyond Queering the Canon. This talk is part of a larger inquiry that is based on two questions that have actually guided most of my research. Firstly, how do we as Indigenous people construct knowledge regarding gender and sexuality? And secondly, what or how is this knowledge made evident in the artistic practice of Indigenous artists? And I'm going to try and make sure that I see if I can. Here we go. There we go. It's working. Settler colonialism has had a profound effect on the transmission of Indigenous knowledge. As it is enacted within contemporary Indigenous communities, activism has sought to retain and renew the knowledge and its systems of acquiring knowledge regarding our gender and sexual identities. Rather than situating Indigenous knowledge in the past, the notion of renewal takes into account the continued evolution of knowledge. I begin this talk with quotes from Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson and Métis writer and scholar Chelsea Vowell to ground this inquiry in the present and also hopefully looking towards the future. In some of my previous talks and writings, I've spoken about historical figures and examined the ways in which they activated and performed an Indigenous knowledge that refutes the naturalization of binary constructions of gender and sexuality. The work of contemporary artists brings this knowledge forward into the present. My intent is to examine how, in spite of the disruptions caused by colonialism, contemporary Indigenous artists continue to express their sexual and gender identities in their artistic practices. In this presentation, I will focus my discussion on how artists engage with this knowledge and how this can be viewed in terms of rupture, renewal, or reclamation of Indigenous constructions of gender and sexuality. However, this undertaking reveals a very complex genealogy. Settler colonialism has had a profoundly deleterious effect on the transmission of Indigenous knowledge. Nowhere is this more evident than in the disruption that has occurred regarding Indigenous understandings of non-binary gender and sexual identities. I'm interested in how the reclamation and activation of Indigenous knowledge concerning gender and sexuality is intimately tied to contemporary Indigenous sovereignty and nation building. So I want to begin with outlining how Indigenous knowledge is related to or connected to contemporary Indigenous sovereignty. Parapicha scholar Michael Lerma explains contemporary Indigenous sovereignty is complex. At the heart of Indigenous sovereignty are the people and their inherent right to self-determination, whether at the national level and or as individuals expressing a specific way of being in the world. This viewpoint is echoed in the work of scholars such as Leanne Simpson and Alex Wilson, who write about the notion of non-interference from an Anishinaabe and a Nakiawe perspective, respectively. In Lerma's model, the first component is that sovereignty is bound in place. This is expressed through the relationship Indigenous people have to each other and to their traditional territories or land base. The second component is having a power base that is articulated in the establishment of norms for behavior, as well as sanctions for the violation of these norms. Norms are often conveyed in kinship and clan responsibilities. These relationships and expectations are related to the third component, which Lerma identifies as supreme authority. This authority is founded in the original instructions or oral traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation. These instructions have been instrumental in settling disagreements and have informed both decisions and behavior. The fourth component is Indigenous institutions that were not always permanent, but were activated in times of need, as when confederacies were formed to repel common enemies or to combat famine. The fifth and final component is legitimacy, both domestic and international. Thus, judicial policy, together with the legitimization of Indigenous nation status, is only one component of Indigenous sovereignty. But that's often, where we focus is the nation-to-nation relationship. And as a consequence, what I'm trying to draw out here is that the idea of sovereignty is much more complex than that. Although all five components are equally important, I focus on demonstrating how the Indigenous sovereign body indeed asserts a sovereignty, rather than remain defiled, and misrepresented by settler colonialism. This sovereignty is intimately tied to and legitimized through norms expressed in our kinship and clan responsibilities, our sacred histories, our ceremonies, traditional homelands, and our languages. These important areas comprise both the second and third components of Lerma's model. It is these ceremonies and languages that provide evidence of how Indigenous knowledge regarding gender and sexuality is constructed from an Indigenous perspective. This also demonstrates that when the Indigenous body embodies or performs from this place, it is capable of revealing the binary construction of gender and its conflation with biological sex is part of the colonial mechanisms that serve to regulate and control Indigenous bodies. Ultimately, the artists and the works they produce are both a manifestation of and a refusal to participate in the nation state's reification of patriarchy and heteronormativity. Based on research conducted for my dissertation, I developed a model informed by discussions with 6 contemporary Indigenous artists. Specifically, my research focused on examining how contemporary Indigenous artists from Canada engage their sexual and gender identities and how these encounters are reflected in their artistic practice and production. In my discussions with each of the artists, it became apparent that the access to information concerning Indigenous constructions of gender and sexuality varied. I recognized the emergence of 3 very distinctive patterns of engagement, which include rupture, renewal, and reclamation. The first pattern, rupture, describes artwork that deals with the impact of internalized and external homophobia. The second articulation is renewal. This artwork employs Indigenous understandings of gender fluidity and its expression in cultural practices in both the process and production of the artist. And the final category is reclamation. This group describes what we are witnessing in the artistic production of emerging LGBTQ2 Two-Spirit Indigenous artists. They are not only reclaiming their non-heteronormative identities, but also examining how the activation of Indigenous concepts of kinship and reciprocity enable Indigenous people to reemerge as sexually empowered and actualized individuals and nations. In this presentation, I will discuss artists whose work falls into these 3 categories. As I mentioned, the first category, rupture, is characterized by artworks that reflects with or deals with the absence or the rupture in the transmission of Indigenous knowledge that occurred as a result of colonization. Both Métis artist Rosalie Favel and Cree artist Thursa Cuthan explore the manifestations of this interruption of the transmission of this knowledge in their artistic practice. Rosalie Fayvel came into her gender and sexual identity in the late 1970s. Growing up in the urban center of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Fayvel talks about coming out as being, quote, scary. It was difficult. It was turning yourself inside out, trying to figure out what was going on. But it was rewarding as I felt like I found a part of myself. I found that little group of people to hang out with, end of quote. Although Fayvel has explored her sexuality throughout an art practice that spans 40 years, I want to speak to some of the work she created as a graduate student at the University of New Mexico, where Fayvel explored her lesbian identity through popular culture icons. In this digital photo image, Maybe I Did Love Her in That Way, is from the series Plains Warrior Artist. Fayvel appropriates imagery from the film The Children's Hour and a popular television show, Xena the Warrior Princess, to explore the changing attitudes regarding lesbianism as it is portrayed in film and in television. The black and white imagery that we see here that takes up the main portion of this image is actually a film still from a film called The Children's Hour, which was based on a true story written first as a play by Lillian Hellerman in 1934. It recounts the tale of two women who open up a private school for girls. After disciplining a student, the student retaliates by spreading a rumor that the two women were lesbians. Although they are eventually cleared and it is revealed that the student lied, the effects of the accusations of lesbianism has tragic consequences. In a very dramatic scene, the character Karen Wright questions her feelings for Martha. The imagery Fayvel uses from the film in this digital photo collage captures the dramatic interplay between the two women when Karen comes to the realization that her feelings for Martha are not natural. In her confession for her love for Martha, Karen is unable to deal with the possibility that she is sexually not normal and consequently commits suicide. The tragic ending was in keeping with the Hays Code, which delineated what could and could not be portrayed in Hollywood film. The wording of the code provides insight into how homosexuality was censored within the Southern colonial nation states and how through its cultural institutions, the hegemony of heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity is confirmed and maintained. The code reads, quote, "In the case of impure love, the love which society has regarded as wrong and which has been banned by divine law, the following are important. 1, impure love must not be presented as attractive and beautiful. 2, it must not be the subject of comedy or farce or treated as material for laughter. 3, it must not be presented in such a way as to arouse passions or morbid curiosity on the part of the audience. 4, it must not be made to seem right and permissible. And 5, in general, it must not be detailed in method and manner," end of quote. The Children's Hour became an iconic film among lesbians. Its tragic ending was indicative of how lesbianism was often dealt with because of the prevailing attitudes in the 1960s as a reflection of the Hays Code. Lesbian was viewed as a fate worse than death. Above the unfolding dramatic scene of Karen's confession of unnatural love for her friend, Fayvel has strategically placed an image of Xena and Gabriel. So we can see these two individuals here. From the popular television series, Xena the Warrior Prince. The series tells of the story of an ex-warlord, Xena, who realizes the error of her ways and seeks to redeem herself with her sidekick, an implied lesbian lover, Gabriel. Together, they journey through ancient worlds, fighting ruthless gods and other warlords for the greater good of mankind. Although the implied lesbian relationship between the two was never consummated on screen, the series was considered revolutionary. As Halford points out, quote, it seriously challenged the problematic aspects of gender essentialism, and it escapes the static notions of sexuality and representations of homosexuality on television by offering characters who can be read as lesbian or bisexual and non-monogamous without the critique of their lifestyles within the narrative, end quote. Yet Xena, like Karen, would die at the end of the series. Fans took to the internet, creating a subculture where homoerotic pairings that the small screen was unable to depict could be realized. These narratives, written by fans of the series, created alternate universes whereby the characters, Xena and Gabriel, became lesbian lovers. Feyvel suggests that for her, too, the relationship between the women was sexual, and also an indication. This is also indicated by the enclosing the image of the embracing women with a hand-drawn heart piercing the arrow, a symbol of romantic love. Popular culture has had a significant impact on how we understand ourselves and see ourselves. It reifies and seldom challenges stereotypes. For people who did not conform to heteronormative expectations, popular culture told us same-sex love and relationships were not normal, and death was better than being a lesbian. Many Indigenous youth and non-Indigenous youth take this message to heart. Feyvel reminds us of this by depicting herself as a young child seated on the arm of the overstuffed chair, located in the bottom right corner of the collage. It is reminiscent of the chairs our parents sat in as our families gathered to watch TV. It's also a reminder of how Indigenous LGBTQ two-spirit people never saw ourselves in popular culture. The 500 years of colonization has contributed to the erasure of the collective memories within our families and communities, resulting in the isolation and judgment leveled at those whose gender identity and sexuality did not conform to heteronormativity, and the internalization of racism. Many have had to deal with homophobia and transphobia, whether they grew up in large urban centers or on reservations or in settlements. This absence or lack of access to information about Indigenous traditional teachings concerning gender and sexuality often has violent repercussions. Colonization and its institutions have all but erased the knowledge of Indigenous constructions of gender and sexuality in many communities. This rupture is also a topic of Cree artist Thursa Cuthand. She often explores this consistently in her work using humor within her artistic practice. In 2015, Cuthand was commissioned by Imaginative to produce the video entitled Two-Spirit Introductory Offer 1999. The video appears to be a lighthearted glimpse into the issues encountered by two-spirited persons coming out. However, underlying the humor is the acknowledgement of the knowledge that has been lost concerning two-spirit identities that include gender variance and sexual identities that are not heteronormative. Using a format reminiscent of an infomercial, Cuthand stands against the projected image of a prairie landscape, referencing the place where she grew up and came to understand her gender and sexual identity. Her Two-Spirit introductory offer promises 24/7 access to traditional knowledge and support. Here, you can consult with Two-Spirit friendly elders. Your subscription also entitles you to monthly offers, such as a beaded whisk, which has a number of possible uses, along with the requisite safe sex supplies. Cuthand's video acknowledges the unique circumstances that two-spirit people face within a mainstream queer world. The dialogue reflects many of the issues and questions CUJAH had when she came out in her teens, including finding a community she felt comfortable with. In the opening scene of the video, CUJAH wields a copy of Walter Williams' book, The Spirit and the Flesh, a text on Indigenous gender and sexual identities. She asked, quote, "New to the two-spirit lifestyle? Do you want to speak to someone in the spirit and the flesh rather than reading The Spirit and the Flesh?" End of quote. Her question is a thinly veiled reference to the ways in which many two-spirit people came to understand that their difference had a history. For many, this knowledge was not available to them because of the many manifestations of colonization. For example, her statement that for the low price of $19.99, her service provides access to two-spirit friendly elders alludes to the debate that has been played out in many arenas within Indigenous communities regarding the conflicting definitions of traditional versus non-traditional practices, as seen in the very public deliberations concerning issues such as same-sex marriage and skirt shaming. Here, CUJAH expresses the very real consequences of Alex Wilson's observation that, quote, "Today, some of our elders and spiritual teachers have adopted and introduced understandings and practices that weren't necessarily a part of their own cultures prior to colonization and the imposition of Christianity," end of quote. CUJAH relates that her mother was very accepting of her disclosure at the age of 14 that she was attracted to other women. Quote, "Overall, it was a good thing. The first person I told was my mom, and she bought me a bunch of books about being queer," end of quote. However, not all family members were as accepting. CUJAH states that some of her immediate family had difficulty accepting her gender and sexual identity. Coming into her gender and sexual identity, CUJAH explains that her non-native peers did not have the same questions or concerns that she had as a two-spirit Indigenous person. She grew up in the urban center of Saskatoon, not in an Indigenous community that was informed about the historic acceptance of gender variance. Throughout her 20-year career of making videos, CUJAH's artistic practice, like Feval's, lays bare the issues that the rupture in the transmission of Indigenous knowledge is realized at a very personal level. Not all artists that I spoke to had this experience, and this difference can be seen in the artistic production of those whose work can be articulated as representing what I've termed as renewal. This artwork employs Indigenous understandings of gender fluidity as it is expressed in cultural practices and both the process and the production of the artists. Anishinaabe artist Barry Ace recalls his experience coming out as a gay man in the 1990s. Although his sexual and gender identities were never questioned, they were never overtly acknowledged either. His sexual and gender identities were not an issue within his Indigenous community. Ace grew up on and off the reserve. He spent many summers with his grandmother, Mary McGregor Ace, and his great aunt, Annie Owl McGregor. At the age of 16, Ace began his apprenticeship with the women in his family and was schooled in the arts of basketry, quill work, and beading, normally the purview of cisgendered women. Throughout his apprenticeship, Ace learned the skills to work in these artistic media. And in keeping with protocol, he also learned the cultural practices and ceremonial knowledge that accompanied them. Through her teachings, his great aunt passed down the knowledge of successive generations of women in his family regarding where, when, and how the material, such as the split ash, could be harvested. She also taught him about the plants and their uses. Ace states that during his apprenticeship, He never actively sought to learn these practices, but rather was chosen by his great aunt to carry these traditions forward. He recollects that others had approached his great aunt and requested to apprentice with her, but she turned them down and focused passing this knowledge onto him. Although Ace knew from a young age that he was attracted to men, it was not something that was ever discussed. Quote, maybe they were an anomaly, but on the reserve, we didn't get teased about being gay. Nothing was ever really said. The only thing that changed when I brought Earl, his partner, home was that they stopped asking about children, end of quote. Ace states that there was never a formal acknowledgement that he was chosen to do these cultural arts because he was gay. However, he does state that the notion of his gender fluidity was very present in his tutoring. Quote, my aunt and grandma were never concerned that I wasn't a woman, although basket weaving was traditionally an activity undertaken by women. Ace says that he was never ridiculed for doing what would have been perceived as, quote, women's work. Maybe that's because, he adds, maybe that's because people recognized it as being protocol. Nobody said, oh, you're just hanging out with the women. Oh, you're just doing women's work. You must be a fag. People actually respected what I was doing, end of quote. Although Ace states that he does not really address his gender or sexuality as a subject matter in his work, there are some recent exceptions to this. Generally, through the artistic media in which Ace works, one can see the influence and knowledge these women shared with him. For example, the beadwork, and we have a slide here, reflects a well-defined Anishinaabe aesthetic of flowing floral designs on a dark velvet cloth background. His grandmother taught him to bead, and as a powwow dancer, he refined his beading skills by making his own regalia and repairing the regalia of his fellow dancers. Through his use of reclaimed computer transistors and receptors, Ace has taken the floral designs to a new level in his desire to demonstrate the confluence between the historic and the contemporary. And I have some image of this here. So this is some of his more recent work. For him, the use of these recycled computer parts functions in the same way as beads, as metaphors for energy. He states that the Anishinaabe word, and I'm really sorry about my pronunciation, for beads actually means little spirits or little spirit berries. Beads, he explains, were a symbolic way of covering someone with power and protection of medicines represented by the plants depicted in the floral designs. These new materials reinforce that symbolism as he arranges them on mesh wire backgrounds in the same floral patterns taught by his grandmother. Always innovative, Ace is of references and pays homage to materials and Indigenous cultural art practice while adding his unique contemporary interpretation. On many levels, Ace consistently grounds his artistic practice in the understanding that a culture must continually evolve to survive. From his apprenticeship with the women in his family, he integrates in his art practice what they taught him about the materials, the cultural teachings, and the responsibilities that are embedded in their use. His apprenticeship, like his artwork, is symbolic of the renewal ceremonies that maintain our cultural ties to each other and our ways of understanding that include the need to embrace all of our relations, regardless of gender and or sexual identity. What does the decolonization of gender and sex and sexuality look like? What does this mean to reclaiming the Indigenous sovereign body? These seem to be questions that are being asked by a newer generation of Two-Spirit Indigenous artists. Rather than focusing on renewal of gender and sexual identities, they're asking what possibilities can be set into motion by Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. These artists not only set out to reclaim the knowledge regarding gender and sexual identities that have created space for the two-spirit body to reemerge, but they are also exploring what other spaces can be opened by this activation. As activists, they are addressing the gendered violence of settler colonialism through their artistic practices. For instance, they are redefining queer sexuality and identity as a rich font of reclaimed power, consent, and mutual respect. According to Indigenous scholar Kim Tallbear, to decolonize sexuality is to reactivate our kinship responsibilities of being in good relations with all of our relatives. Within the context of many Indigenous worldviews, the notion of relative includes all animate beings. McCaslin and Brettner write that good relations require respect, which involves finding ways to work things out not by coercion, but rather by honoring the needs, views, interests, competence, and autonomy of others. This is what Adrian Simpson refers to when she states, quote, many of our societies normalize gender variance in sexual orientation, and all different kinds of relationships, as long as they were consistent with our basic values of consent, transparency, respect, and reciprocity. We weren't queer until our settlers came into our communities and positioned the queer parts of our relationships and societies as defiant, abnormal, and sinful, end of quote. Questioning the settler forms of sexuality and the differentiation between the pornographic and erotic, Danger describes her current work as an exploration of the complicated dynamics of sexuality, gender, and power in a consensual feminist manner. Danger calls herself a feminist pornographer. According to Tristan Termano, this concept grew out of what became known as the feminist porn wars of the 1980s. The divide between the opposing fractions of feminism is based on the role that pornography is thought to play in the exploitation and oppression of women versus the role it plays in creating alternative images and developing its own aesthetics and iconography to expand established sexual norms and discourses. For Danger, the aesthetic practices she borrows from porn and fashion industries, such as presentation of the scantily clothed or nude body, are intended to, quote, challenge the ways in which our bodies have been consumed in a way that doesn't feel consensual and doesn't feel like it's authentic or it's our own, end of quote. Other references to pornography and the fashion industry are subtle, with the use of the flesh tone backdrops and the high key lighting. Danger's process is collaborative because those participating have agency, and there's a reciprocity in the relationship between herself and the cis and trans women she photographs. Danger shares that she does not have her collaborators sign model releases because she doesn't want to own the images. Each time she displays the work, she must renegotiate the terms. The empowerment for the women participating in the photographs comes from their agency. These Indigenous women have a presence in the larger than life images. They take up space and command the viewer's attention. Her series entitled Big Ones, she states, is, quote, all about reclaiming pornography, media, our gaze, our bodies, and projecting it in a way that is challenging, end of quote. It is challenging for some people. The presentation of the female nude body creates a certain level of anxiety, especially around the issue of objectification. In this image, the nude collaborator stands in front of a flesh-toned backdrop facing the viewer, her body oiled, a practice shared by bodybuilders to accentuate the body's curves and musculature. Around her neck is a black choker, and on her sternum is the tattoo of a matrix in the shape of a star. And to the left of this are tattooed words, but only one word, sur, French for sisters, is legible. On the right lower thigh is a buffalo skull tattoo. Next to it is another tattoo that reads, Chaos Reigns. She covers her pubic area with a set of caribou antlers. The pairing of the nude female body with antlers, Danger explains, is to address the parallels between the predation of game hunting and the sexual predation of Indigenous women. The misogynistic language of sport hunting sexualizes animals, women, and weapons, and speaks about them in ways as if they were interchangeable. Citing an article by Linda Karloff in an interview, Danger connects this type of violence to the violence enacted upon the bodies of Indigenous women. Her artist statement for the exhibition of this series at the Artist Run Gallery, Latitude 53 in Edmonton, reads, quote, "Biguns is an act of reclaiming power over our sexualities," end of quote. She adds that the colonial history of residential schools, sexual abuse, and intergenerational trauma has had a profound effect on Indigenous women's ability to have healthy relationships and a positive self-image. The line between what is considered pornographic and erotic is always indistinct, because what is considered pornographic in one community is not in another. These lines also change over time. In the 2017 summer edition of the cover of Canadian Art, it featured an image from Big Ones. The title in Cree syllabics translates to On Turtle Island. The theme of the publication was kinship. Recognizing the importance of kinship is emblematic of this new generation of Two-Spirit artists. The placement of this image on the cover of the magazine is a stark reminder of the differences between those who embrace a hierarchy that enables the exploitation of women, animals, and the earth as part of a natural order, and those who believe that our survival depends upon the survival of all beings. The latter concept of interdependence is an extension of kinship and the responsibilities and duties of being in good relationship with all beings. This is a reoccurring theme in the work of artists engaging with Indigenous communities as part of their practice. Danger's work addresses the ways in which Indigenous understandings of gender and sexuality are being reclaimed by focusing on the creative process as a means to build community and decolonize the Indigenous body. She actively recovers non-binary understandings of gender and sexuality through her art practice. The art practice of this generation of artists is focused on the process of artistic production and not the end product. It is based on building relationships and reciprocity. Danger's artistic practice involves informed consent and negotiation between her and her collaborators. In incorporating these methodologies, she introduces a process that is underscored by reciprocity and egalitarian relationships. The idea of a singular art star and celebrity status is replaced by the potential of art to heal and reclaim one's sovereignty and self-determination, and to act from a place of empowerment rather than victimization. The satisfaction for Indigenous LGBTQ Two-Spirit and their allies is realizing that the revolutionary nature of our cultural teachings will no longer be contained, as we are witnessing in the artistic production of these artists. These artists demonstrate the ways in which we can work towards being good relations. We are intended to be And in doing so, we are doing what Chelsea Vow has noted, reclaiming these teachings and redefining them in bold new ways for the 21st century. To reactivate the knowledge regarding Indigenous constructions of gender, identity, and sexuality is to assert our sovereignty as individuals and as nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us today. And we just wanted to open up the platform to some questions from the audience now. So you can all take a second to put in any questions in the chat, or if you would rather raise your hand and use your voice, that's also always an option. So we already have a question in the chat, which was that if they were wondering if you could explain the concept of two-spirit identity more and how it relates to gender and sexual identity of Indigenous artists.
Okay, first of all, I think I have to kind of go back to the genesis of the term, and specifically that the term was coined in the 1990s. And what it does, it marks a moment in two-spirit history of taking back and reclaiming and naming ourselves and basing that on an Indigenous understanding as opposed to a Western understanding. So you will see most often, if you look up two-spirit and you go and you'll see videos and people talk about what it means. In some instances, it's more like it's an umbrella term. And it was a term that kind of came about to mark a moment when Indigenous people started to ground their identities in Indigenous knowledge as opposed to Western constructions. So what it is often referred to as a term that is used to describe an individual, or an individual identifies as being two-spirit, and a very kind of straightforward way of talking about it is the notion of having both masculine and feminine, for lack of a better word, let's just say energies, these two opposing energies exist in the individual. And as opposed to often, way other people look at it is like you have, mostly feminine energy, or you have masculine energy. But if you are an individual who is considered as being two-spirit, those energies are both present in the person. Now, it's kind of taken on a different, not everybody identifies as two-spirit because it has certain kinds of different interpretations when you translate it into different Indigenous languages. But I will say that it's an important term, and I think the most, what we're seeing is more Indigenous people that do not identify as heteronormative are taking up the terms that are based in their language, as opposed to using two-spirit. So two-spirit is just actually an umbrella term. But I would encourage you to kind of just, do a quick search on the internet and see, how different people are interpreting it. But the main idea is it's not heteronormative, and you don't express your sexuality as heteronormative. And there's even people, like I will say, within the Indigenous community that will not use that term because they prefer to use the term as it is understood in their own language. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And another question that we have is if you could speak to the role of archival and archives in preserving tradition and traditional knowledge.
I think, yeah, archive, I think when I think of archive, I think of the stories. So I'm not thinking about, the archive in terms of, these buildings that hold files and, that kind of thing. I'm thinking, our elders are the archives. Our oral traditions are the archives. Our language are the archives. So, the idea that, specifically when we think about, the history or going back to non-heteronormative people existing, the fact that there are in our languages terms, that is part of the archive. The fact that I talked about Thurza's work, and she has a video that came out very recently. It's under the National Film Board, and it's called The Dress. And so it's a kind of, she's talking to an aunt, and her aunt relates this story of a non-binary individual, and talks a little bit about how this story has been something, that circulated in their family, but because of missionization, that it wasn't told that often, but then now it's kind of opening up the space for these stories to be told. And so her aunt shares this story. So that's our archive. Because when we think about what actually goes into the archive, somebody's making a decision about what is preserved and what isn't preserved. And in many cases that because of the prevailing attitudes of a settler nation state, and specifically what stories get preserved, the archive, like as we, normally see it, that isn't where we need to go to recover our stories.
Thank you. Kind of on the same note, someone was wondering how relationships between gender and sovereignty manifest in the works of an artist like Dania Danger. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on that, and also maybe like how yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I think in terms of when we talk about the notion that's put forward by both Simpson and Wilson, and that notion of non-interference, the idea that not all, but like in this specific example, because Alex is from Cree Nation, and Leanne is from an Anishinaabe nation, we're talking not only the sovereignty of nation, but the sovereignty of the individual. And so in Dana Danger's work, this idea of agency and recognizing the agency of those individuals that she's photographing. So, like even in my presentation, I didn't show any of those images, but rather a public image that everyone would have had access to, is again, this idea of how she has to negotiate every time she shows the work of these individuals to be seen. It's not, as an artist that you take the normal practice. I started as a photographer. The normal practice is if you have somebody model for you, you get them to sign a model release, and then you own the image. And so you get to use it however you want. Whereas in the case of Dana, is that she doesn't have them sign a model release, but rather she has to negotiate and check with them whether or not they want their image to be shown. So in that sense, it's giving, talking about the sovereignty of the individual, of making the decision in terms of whether or not they want their image to be shown in an exhibition or in a book. But like I said, and that's kind of a nightmare for an artist. And I, from my own experience of being a photographer, of having to go back and constantly seek out the permission of the model in order to show an image.
Thank you. And kind of elaborating on that a bit more, you talked about negotiating with collaborators for big ends. And so would you say that this is one of the ways to share the profit materially and so on with collaborators and like acknowledging them as co-artists?
I think that's a really good observation in that regard of, the changing relationship. And even if we think about, how, what Dana's doing is very different than what we see in the mainstream art world. Perhaps, thinking about, this idea, the notion of, being in good relation, that this in itself is perhaps an example of an Indigenous methodology in terms of art practice.
Yeah, and you mentioned being in good relation a few times throughout your talk, and I was wondering if maybe you could take a few moments just to talk about what that means for you and for and for some of the artists that you're talking about.
I can talk, mostly in terms of like myself, in terms of what does that mean, in that, like I said, to give an example is, I think is, what Dana does in terms of how she works with, her fellow, the models, is that there isn't a hierarchy there. But rather a recognition that everybody kind of brings something to make this happen. It's like, us gathering today, it's just like I'm presenting a paper, but at the same time, everybody that's involved in this is bringing, a certain kind of expertise or adding something to the mix in order to kind of create further discussion or to expand on ideas. In my own practice, thinking about that, is, when one of the things that when you write about someone is normally you share what you're going to write with them. When you interview someone, like we have this practice within, the university, that you have to go through ethics review prior to, interviewing someone and then publishing that. But it's also talking to people, but then, checking back with them, is this what you meant? Am I taking what you said out of context? Are you okay with what I'm writing? Is this a representation of what you meant to say to me? And that's not normally how, our discipline in terms of art history goes, is that, people have written about other people's work and never even spoken to them. So, that's always interesting, and particular, especially if you're working with contemporary artists. I think that this is something that you're working in collaboration with them. You're seeing something, that you're witnessing something that they're talking about. And as, an art historian, it's kind of creating this space for this work to be seen. And I see it as a collaboration. I'm not an expert. And I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm just trying to figure out things too, and I think that when we think about how to be in good relation, with people, it's about, respecting that everybody brings something, we're not, empty vessels, but everybody has something to contribute.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions about Danger's work, so I think people really connected with that. So one of the questions is relating to notions of agency and sovereignty. Are there ways in which Danger's work connects to the politics of submission as linked to refusal, as a negotiation of trust, accountability, etc.?
That's very well put. That's a great question, in terms of, because I think you're also answering the question yourself in terms of that, in that definitely, there is within that a refusal on many levels. There is also, the notion of, the constant negotiation, that we all do, in our relationships with each other, is that there's a constant negotiation that takes place. And I think Dana brings that into, the art practice, and makes it visible. And because, the fact whenever you're working with individuals, which she is doing, as opposed to, an artist that perhaps might just work with ideas. That her work in itself, has this ability to kind of manifest and make visible this idea of sovereignty and agency.
Thank you. So another question that kind of connects to sovereignty is someone was asking if you could point to a source or a artist or a platform that explores this concept a bit more, especially when, especially an Indigenous artist or source. And they said, thank you so much.
I'm just trying to think, like, in terms of like, this is from my dissertation. I'm a fairly new PhD, 3 years, 4 years. And so as I was, doing my research, the hardest thing for me to find were models. And so when I came upon Lerma's model of contemporary Indigenous sovereignty, that was like a godsend for me. It was like all of a sudden I had this framework that kind of open, these ideas for me. And I'm trying to think, off the top of my head, artists, that are working with the notion of sovereignty. I think they, in many instances, they're all doing that and exercising their agency, bringing, into the contemporary realm, these ideas regarding what is it like to be an individual who is non-binary, who has, a non-heteronormative expression of, gender and sexuality. But in terms of there's a number of artists. There's artists, for example, and I'm not remembering. There's an artist in Alaska who is a weaver, and he also is a fashion designer. So bringing, kind of these ideas into, the contemporary realm. There's a number of artists that are doing it. And of course, I'm going to go blank because I can't, off the top of my head, think of, specific individuals. I think of another artist that I talk about in the dissertation, but I don't talk here, is Adrian Simpson, and his performance work in terms of Buffalo Boy, and who else am I thinking of right now? Another artist who is also very active, Erin Cosmos, who is Métis, originally from the Lac Saint Anne area. And a lot of her work is around social justice issues. In particular, you might have seen some of her poster work. Where her work differs is that she will create posters and then put them online, and people can access them and utilize them. So she's done posters that dealt with the Starlight Tours. She's also done a poster called Our Bodies Are Not Terranilius. So there's another, artist that is really grounded in community-based activism and is working, not necessarily within the gallery, but rather within the community and utilizing, their resources, their skills, and their abilities to bolster activism at the community level. So that's, Erin is another really good example of that.
Thank you. So I think there's still some questions about the question of agency. And one person from Facebook asked, they were wondering about the selection process of what Indigenous artwork becomes accessible for Canadians, and how that affects the agency of both the artists and Indigenous peoples as a whole. and also like what changes should happen in like the selection process. I don't know what they mean by selection process, but maybe what's given visibility in order to give a larger voice to these artists.
Well, I think, we've seen some examples of it, in terms of exhibitions. There's also some, issue in terms of, Adrian Simpson did an exhibition years ago, and I'm not remembering the name of it, but it was at the Mackenzie, and what was really interesting is that it was all talking about Indigenous, what's the word for it? Kind of erotica, that's what it was. It was about erotica. And so what was really interesting is that in the selection process is that Leanne included non-binary artists or artists that identified as LGBTQ two-spirit artists. And it wasn't a separate category, but rather included in, the whole exploration of the erotic. And then, we had the exhibition, what was it, 2-3 years ago in Vancouver, that, featured artists that identified as two-spirit LGBTQ artists. And it was, I think it was called Unsettling. And so it's those kinds of opportunities. It's also in terms of, I think that with the internet, I think that in some ways that democratizes, has the possibility of democratizing space and providing opportunities for those individuals that might not be seen in, these kind of traditional gallery spaces to actually have, their work out there and present. Of course, I could see why people wouldn't do it as well because of, particularly what we see happening in that it's still a very violent world for those who are non-binary or, identify differently. So even though these kinds of formats provide us with, this more access, there's also with that, it's still not safe. So in terms of providing opportunities, part of it comes from, like as teachers, if you're teaching in a class and you're talking about Indigenous art, make an effort to look at artists who actually identify, differently and, talk about their work. And I do know that there are certain artists that are considered, art stars, and that everybody kind of goes to these individuals as kind of the spokespersons. It's over time that, that other artists kind of come into the forefront, specifically. And part of that is just through exposure and getting the opportunities.
Thank you. One person asked about how a transnational global culture affects sexuality and gender in Indigenous culture. So I guess like what the implications are for artists and queer Indigenous communities in general with this idea of like a I guess like globalism and the transnational global culture of sexuality.
Well, I will say that there's one thing that I'm really interested in exploring. I don't know that much about, but I do know, for example, in many Indigenous cultures across the world that, the idea of people who were, I don't want to use the word LGBTQ because that's kind of a Western formation, but other people that express their gender and sexuality differently, that, there are many cultures, Indigenous cultures, that had had these individuals or places where they weren't treated like they were within the Western, the same way that you are treated in, I'm not saying this really well, but I am interested in terms of this idea, like how do we as Indigenous people construct this knowledge, and what are some of the symbols, or what are some of the ways that this is expressed? So looking at Indigenous languages, looking at our oral traditions. And, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I'm still working through myself, is this idea that maybe it isn't the body within Indigenous, like my understanding, like for North America, maybe it isn't the body that's gendered. Maybe for us, it was the task that was gendered. Because we have all kinds of stories, that oral traditions that, that come from the beginning of time, where people shift and change, that you would move from being, a person could move from being, like in this form to, the form of a bear. There are stories where, where women married bear and had children. It's the idea, you know what I mean? It's like, it's the act that is gendered and not necessarily the body. And that's some of the things that I'm interested in exploring, the commonalities between Indigenous nations across the world. If whether or not, this whole construct of, how the gender and sex are conflated is actually a Western construction that seems to be, or has become, normalized, and how do we disrupt it? And I think that, if anything, that's what I'm interested in looking, how do we disrupt this normalization? And in doing so, then how do we, and does this not create space for everybody? That's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I really like the idea of like the task being gendered and not the body. I think that's really interesting. So you mentioned feminism when discussing Dana Danger's work. And how do you see Indigenous perspectives intersecting with feminism? And how do we build a feminist movement that protects and nurtures Indigenous peoples?
Oh, that's big. I'm actually teaching a course on Indigenous feminism this semester. And I think that for Indigenous people, our engagement, women with feminism is one that's very fraught, especially when we think of what our communities were like prior to contact, prior to the imposition of, legislation such as the Indian Act, to the destruction of our governance systems, our traditional governance systems, where women had a very important role. And I think that in terms of reclaiming that, I think that's important for us to understand that this is not, normal. This is a system that has been imposed upon us by a patriarchy, and the many different forms and shapes that it takes. It's also tied to, an economic system that creates a hierarchy. And so I think those are the things that we have to look at. And we have to look at how tied even the power structure that we see, in operation, and we just have to look to our neighbors in the South to see that becoming undone. I think that out of any of this is with chaos, it's again, that idea that it is opportunity. So, in terms of building a feminist movement or more inclusive movement, that even though what we're seeing is really unsettling, out of that, comes this opportunity to dismantle what does not work. My version of the new world.
Thank you. So this is more of like a general question for you, but someone asked if you have any thoughts on publishing your PhD. It would really add to the literature on Indigenous art and decolonizing methodologies, and we need more of these publications in our academic libraries. And someone else also asked if we could have the link to your ResearchGate or academia profile, so we could link that in the chat if that's okay with you.
Sure, that's fine. In terms, there's an essay coming out in Heather Egalitarian and Carla Taunton's book. It's a Rutledge reader, I believe. It's on Indigenous methodologies in art history. That's upcoming. So there's an essay in that. I'm still actually, I'm doing talks more or less based on the dissertation. Part of what you're hearing today is part of the dissertation. But eventually I'm trying to work on a manuscript that kind of looks at, the beginnings of the Two-Spirit movement and how it kind of moved from, grounding our, gender and sexual identities and Indigenous knowledge to where, we are more moving towards social justice. So it's tentatively titled The Invention of the Indigiqueer, the social justice movement to a identity movement to social justice. That's just, it's like getting the time in, being able to do the research. And right now, because of our situation, I haven't been able to travel and visit the archives to look. So eventually I'm, hopefully I will be able to produce something based on that, but I'm not going to publish the dissertation. Things change so rapidly in this. I really think that there's so much that has happened, in the 4 years that I wrote this or, defended it. So I'm not looking at publishing it, but I'm starting from scratch and doing something similar along the same lines, but looking at it and using the arts in order to trace that movement.
Okay, thank you. And we have like a very general, broad question. And it's are there any ways or like directions that you see Indigenous art forms going forward or like in the future?
Oh, they're always going forward. Just like even think of, here at Concordia, we have that whole center, Indigenous Futures. I've been reading a book, an edited volume by Joshua Whitehead on, Indigenous futures or, love in at the end of the world, kind of thing. There's a lot that's out there, a lot of people that are producing works that are looking at that, and especially through the mediums of, the graphic novel and also in the writing. But yeah, always, like you think about Indigenous art is always about the future. It's always about the past. It's like situating yourself, looking forward, looking back. And you see that often in the work that is being created by Indigenous artists.
Thank you. I think that's all of our questions. I don't know if there are any coming. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Kari.
Yeah, I was, well, thank you so much, first of all, for this like wonderful talk. So intriguing and so fascinating. I was really interested when you were talking about, really focusing, it was kind of at the end of your presentation about, the value in the artistic production in a lot of Indigenous contemporary artists. And you had mentioned about Barry Ace, about how, the process of kind of learning these traditional beading practices from the women's community was something that was really, significant in their work, as well as with Dana Danger, how the process was, perhaps even more important than the end product. And I was wondering if you could just maybe speak a bit more to that, about how Indigenous contemporary artists who perhaps identify as LGBTQIA two-spirited plus, see maybe the artistic process as being, a very valuable component in reclaiming and renewing these stories, traditions, and reclaiming Indigenous sovereignty.
And going back to the earlier in terms of relationships, and that's so much an important part of the process. And it's no coincidence that a lot of artists, Indigenous artists, work in collaboration. That is, you know what I mean, in terms of you don't work in isolation, but rather, you know, community, it's community building. There's, you know, many projects where, you know, artists are working, you know, with other artists from Indigenous communities elsewhere. But that idea of relationship, of being in relationship with other people, of being responsible too. I think that that's one thing that's really interesting with many Indigenous artists is this sense of being responsible to community. And that that often, you know, people are really careful about what they say because, you know, there's the acknowledgement that they are speaking for themselves and not necessarily for the community, but they have a responsibility to community. And I don't necessarily, and I don't want to, you know, be, you know, general, but that isn't the same kind of, that responsibility isn't what is often carried by non-Indigenous artists. And so I think that the work is always somehow reaffirming, you know, community, reaching out, you know, like even in Rosalie's work about community, of finding community, finding a place. That is, I think, one of the underlying aspects of, you know, Indigenous artists is that they often are working in community and have a sense of their responsibility to that community.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. I think that's all the questions we have. Sarah, are there any more? Okay, well, thank you so much again, Dr. McGeough, for your lovely presentation today and for sharing your knowledge with us. Your research is very intriguing, exciting, and imperative to art history as a discipline. We would also just like to thank Fourth Space again for their hospitality and generous support in helping us facilitate the event. So thanks, Anna and Doug. And finally, we'd just like to announce that our second event of our Coffee Dates series is happening next Wednesday at the same time, 1 p.m. And we'll be featuring Esser Kalixbia and Malay Cuff, two Black artists who will be coming together in conversation. So you can find more info about that on Facebook, which I think one of our team members will post the link in the chat. But all the registration info will be available soon on the Facebook event. But yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you all there next week again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll just be closing the webinar now. Thanks for joining us today. Great job, Kari, with that intro. Kari was on double duty here, representing both CUJAH and Fourth Space today. And thanks again, Michelle, for your immense investment here in terms of time and energy on the first day of classes. We really appreciate you being here with us. Thanks, everybody, Yara and CUJAH. We'll see you next week. So we're going to close up now. Bye.